elfy ears again. I have had the privilege of being asked to film another tutorial for you. I previously did a tutorial on Necrons, and this time I'm going to be showing you how to paint a specific Sylvaneth scheme that I do. So here's the scheme. So it will look something like this when finished. Okay, and to demonstrate, I'm going to be painting a Treelord. So obviously there will be some differences, but the main scheme itself will be very similar. Okay, so these are the paints that I use in this scheme. You don't necessarily need quite so many shades. It depends how many highlights you want to add in and how much variety of colour. The main one that you definitely do need is the contrast there at the back. It's pretty much the first time I've used contrast. I was a little bit on the fence about it at first, but it's definitely got its uses and it works really well in this scheme. So yeah, these are all the paints that I'm using. The first thing that I did was undercoated my Treelord in Grey Seer undercoat, and just before I come to paint it, I'm just going to use a makeup brush to just dust it off, make sure that there's no dust that I'm going to be painting into the model. So the first job is to get contrast paint on any areas that are not going to be blue. So I'm going to leave the tabard and the beard and these tendrils up here, and the rest will be contrast painted. So I'm just using an old brush and making sure that I'm getting that contrast paint into all the recesses. One thing I find with contrast is it's quite easy to miss bits, especially on Sylvaneth. So you've just got to be really careful not to miss any bits, because it's a little bit tricky to correct after the fact. Making sure that it's not pooling too much in areas that you don't want it to pool. So yeah, I'm just going to carry on and get the rest of that done, and I will restart the video when I move on to the next bit. So now I have base coated pretty much everywhere in contrast. I'm going to pick out the main blue areas. I will also be doing the little like mushrooms and things in blue as well, but we'll add those in later. So for now I am just going to base coat in Dark Reaper here, here and here. I am using a better brush for this. This is my Rosemary & Co. number 2, just because I don't want to make too much of a mess on this stage now, seeing as I've got a base coat in. I do use a wet palette, which I've got. I use the Redgrass Everlasting Wet palette, which is obviously really helpful just to make sure that your paints aren't too thick. I'm just going to put some of that on my palette. Right, let's go. This is quite tricky actually, because it's a very textured surface. I am waiting for that to dry before I put the second coat on, I'm going to do the mushrooms now. I'm using Thousand Suns Blue to base coat these, just for a bit of variety, and I'm using this brush for this. Again, I'm going to put some on my wet palette. Go from there. This is pretty fine detail, hence the small brush. I'm going to pick out anything that looks kind of like a mushroom or fungus. So I want to break up this brown a little bit. I've now done 2 coats of Dark Reaper and 2 coats of Thousand Suns Blue. So this is how he's looking currently. I'm now going to look at these rune areas. So I have watered down to almost the consistency of a wash some blue horror. On my palette there, and I'm going to take my smallest brush and I'll start down here on this one. Basically just seep it into the recesses. Not too worried if it goes where it shouldn't be, so I can always fix that later. It's just going to water that down a little bit more so that it hopefully won't make quite so much of a mess on the next bit. It's a bit better. It's just nice to pick these out because they're a nice bit of relief detail. They look quite effective if you're willing to make a bit of a mess to to do so. He's also got quite a lot. So there's one there. So currently that's how we're looking. You can see that it dries quite nice and bright, which again just helps to break up the brown. So now I'm going to move on to tidying that up. So I'm going to just spend a bit of time now tidying up where I've done those runes. I've done it here, and you can see that that blue seeps in and makes a nice bright contrasting colour against the brown. The way to tidy them up is to get your smallest brush and go back in with your contrast paint, but being very careful not to seep it into the recesses. So I'll show you on this one. It's very delicate work. I think I've got enough paint on. Nope. Just so that it covers the excess, and try and blend it back out into the main body. Otherwise, the problem with contrast paint is it creates almost I want to call it a watermark, where you can see where you've gone and touched up. So if you try and blend it steadily back out into the main body, that hides that a little bit better. And I am going straight from the pot. Right, so I have been around with contrast paint and just touched up all those messy areas. So he's currently looking like this. Fairly happy with it. And I'm now just going to add a blue wash to all the blue areas, so that includes mushrooms. And to do it quite heavily, I'm just using a small Citadel base brush for this one. Is done. I also filled in this rune on his head because I missed that one before. So now I'm going to start on the leaves while this is drying off. I'm using Mephiston Red and a small Citadel base brush. Now, unpopular opinion time, this brush has a slight hook on it. Personally, I find that they do have their uses. I know lots of people absolutely hate them, but for certain things they're quite useful because the little hook just allows you to get into quite tricky to reach places. So I find them quite useful for doing some detail. So I'm just going to go, this is a big job now, I'm just going to go by every single leaf and paint it to red, making sure you do the front and the back. I tend to do all of the fronts first in a section and then I'll do all the back. Try to be as systematic as possible because otherwise you're likely to miss some. Sylvaneth have a lot of fine detail on them and it's really easy to miss bits. once all the leaves are red, that's how we are looking so far. Yes, I found another rune that I'd missed. Okay, now I am going to go in with yellow on the leaves for the highlight of the leaves. Right, I will need a small brush. So using this one again. Add some to my palette. Now I'm just doing the tips and kind of around the edge. I'll just do it to demonstrate. So that's the kind of shape that I'm trying to achieve. I won't get that on all of them, there's a lot of leaves, but that's the kind of effect I'm after. You can see that it draws the eye really nicely, and once we've added the tones of red and yellow into the main body, it all ties in really nicely. At the moment it looks a little bit disjointed, but it should all tie in nicely at the end. Make sure that I'm doing both sides as well. I'll come back and do the reverse in a minute. I'm also doing this on the back. If you go on too thick, you can just wipe it off. Don't feel you need to pick out every edge. It's just a few to catch the eye. It's quite a difficult area to get to. Next I'm going to dry brush that bit that we've just been working on. I'm using a really old rubbish Corax White that is basically now the consistency of a dry paint. Just going to make sure I've not got too much on. And I'm just going to dry brush the entire tabard very lightly to begin with. Just to really catch those edges. It also creates a nice worn look, which I like. Not everybody does, but in certain areas it's nice. So after a quick dry brush, that's how the tabard's looking. So it's just brought it up enough to look a bit more interesting. Now I'm going to do similar with this area. I'm going to add a Thousand Suns blue highlight to any edges I can get to quite easily. I'm also going to do the rune here as I did before with Blue Horror, and just pick out a few other areas, and then I will dry brush it. Not got too much paint. Just while I'm waiting for that room to dry, I'm going to do these leaves that are on the beard itself. I'm going to leave them in the blue tone rather than red and yellow. So I'm going to paint these Thousand Sun blue. And we'll add a highlight of Fenrisian Grey in a moment. Now that's all sorted, I'm going to dry brush the beard with Corax White again. Too much paint. Now I'm going to do this bit, same again, add a couple of Thousand Suns blue, Thousand Suns blue highlights and then a dry brush. So we'll crack right on and do that. Now on this one I'm going to pick out more of the thorns than anything else. Let's add a bit of a dry brush to that. Now these are really thin and spindly, so it's going to be a very gentle dry brush. Let's see. Just going to support this arm a bit because I've had a few issues with it already. It did not want to stick. It's just enough to give it a bit more about it really. Do the other side as well. There we go. Now I'm just going to add that Fenrisian Grey highlight that I mentioned earlier. There we go. So, should have something looking like this so far. Next thing I'm going to look at is this little gem here. Now, sometimes I start something and don't really have any idea where it's going. So bear with me a little bit on this one. I'm going to start by base coating it in Thousand Suns of blue. I'm going to leave the rim of it in Dark Reaper. So that there's a nice contrast. Now, while it's still wet, to get some Fenrisian Grey on my wet palette, make sure it's nice and thin, and to attempt a bit of a wet blend. I'm going to place it in the middle. So I've got too much water on, hold on. just going to move it around. I think it just needs a dot of blue horror. Right in the middle. So sometimes gambling pays off. So it was a very small wet blend. Pretty happy with how that turned out. Going to move on to mushrooms next. All I'm going to do for those is a dry brush in Corax White. Again, making sure I've not got too much paint. I'm just going to catch the edges of those mushrooms to make them stand out a bit more. Try my best not to get it on the model itself, but it's not the end of the world if I do. Next I am going to look at the eyes. Now I have base coated them in Thousand Suns Blue, and I think I'm going to use Blue Horror again in that really watered down, almost wash. State, and then I'm going to just seep it into the recesses. I'm going to want to give the effect of glowy eyes, so I'll go back in a second with a darker colour. Now the eyes have dried, I'm going to use Thousand Suns Blue, which just doesn't want to stay open. I have a paintbrush in my mouth, bear with me. Right, and I'm going to put that on the eyeball, I suppose it's called. Just make sure you can actually see. I'm just concentrating on one eye at the moment. So, let's see, I'm going to go back in with contrast just to touch up the overpaint. I'm going to add a dot of Abaddon Black now into the middle to make a pupil. And then that just needs a dot of Corax White, and that really is only a dot. Too much paint. Like that. And then I will add some gloss varnish to that. Now I just need to do the same on the other one. After a bit of faffing around, I've got the eyes looking pretty even, and as I mentioned, I'm going to add a thin layer of Ard Coat just to give them a bit of a shine. You don't have to do this, it really was just an afterthought on my part. I'm also going to add some to this gem. Right, the next job is probably the biggest, which, knowing me, is why I've left it until last. But it's adding the highlights and the layers to the wood itself. So as you can see on here, I've added a lot of red, orange and yellow. So I need to do that with this one now. There's no real hard or fast rules regarding how to do this. I genuinely just do it by eye. I'll start in one section and go from there. I usually go around the whole model in the red, and then I'll go over in orange and then yellow. The yellow is used really sparingly though, but I do use a lot of red. So I'm looking for any edges that I can pick out using the side of my brush. It always looks really bright at first, but it always dries in a far more appealing way. So red tones are added now. It's a pretty big job, but I've managed to work my way around the whole model. And now I'm going to add a few orange ones. I'm going to do this in a very similar way, but just not as many. I quite often go over the red as well, again, in the orange. I'm using Squig Orange at the moment. As I said, I won't be using many of these. To make sure that paint's not too thick. This nice rich wood colour scheme. There's reds and oranges in there. Last stage of it is to add some yellow in, but this is very, very sparingly because it's obviously yellow is quite a bright colour. So I tend to only add it to the very tips of things. So I'm going to add it down here. Almost finished model. The final thing, just to help tie it all together a bit more, is a final dry brush. Very, very, very light one. And Corax White again. And that just helps to tie it all back together a little bit. So after a dry brush, that is the model complete. Now time for basing. So I have quite a complicated system for these. feel free to do whatever you want. This is just what I use. So it will be Sterling Mud applied with the GW texture tool, but you can use whatever works for you. I've got some slate from the garden to have a play around with, some tufts, which I believe were Rival Crafts, autumn woods and fern moss foliage from Rival Crafts, PVA in a spray bottle with a pipette, and then I use Woodland Scenics. This is the ballast. I think this is called the Burn Earth one. I've got the big shaker bottles and I just use them from these little jars. So the first thing I'm going to do is put Sterling Mud down. The Sterling Mud is still drying, it's quite a good opportunity to apply base materials, so randomly scatter it on. So as you can see, it's built up a nice variety. And then to help that dry, and just to make sure it sticks, I'll usually spray a little bit of PVA on. And then that needs to be left to dry for quite a long time. So I'm going to leave it overnight and then I will finish the base off in the morning. Right, I left this overnight to dry and set a little bit better. Still a bit loose, but it's not really an issue. So now I'm going to add a bit of slate and finish this base off. Let's have a look. A few different pieces. It doesn't need a great deal. You don't want to go overboard. Just move you down a bit. There we go. Probably just a bit here, and then I can add in some moss, etc. I'm going to use super glue to stick it down because it's pretty much the only thing that really works. And you need to make sure that you give it time to set. So making sure that you glue the contact points. I'll attempt not to glue my fingers like I usually do. Put that down, press it down. And then I'm just going to leave that alone. I'm going to add in some tufts. These are sticky on the back, so generally don't need glue, but sometimes it can be helpful. Put one there. And it's really important with basing that you don't go overboard. You need to do just enough, but not too much. And I'm just going to add some fern moss to this bit. But particularly with this scheme, I feel that the base brings it together right at the end. So I do tend to spend a while. Now, with using preserved foliage, it's important to select a bit that matches the colour palette, because obviously there's such a variation in colour. So I want something similar to these tufts. It's quite a good piece. So something like that is a nice shape. So keep that. I'm going to slot these here, I think, so that they protrude out. And I'm going to use super glue again, just to make sure that they don't go anywhere. Use this bit as well. There we go. That is really all this guy needs. It's just enough to break up the ground covering, but not too much that it detracts from the model. So final step is to paint the rim. Right, to paint the rim, I'm just going to thin down some Abaddon Black on my wet palette. Use a pretty large, I prefer a flatter brush to do the rim, and it will take 2 coats. It's much better to do 2 thin coats rather than do a really thick one, because it just looks clumpy. Trying to keep as neat as possible. Obviously you can paint the rim whatever colour you want. I paint all of mine black. I just feel it finishes it off really nicely, but I know that other people have different colour preferences, so whatever works for you. But I would definitely say that painting the rim is an important final step. It makes the mini look finished. And here is the finished product. So hopefully you enjoyed the video and it was helpful in some way. Thank you to Warhipster for asking me to do another video, and if you would like to see any more of my work, you can find me on Instagram as EffieElfears.
Thank you so much, Liz, for doing that. This Treelord Ancient recipe is amazing. I think it looks absolutely stunning, and I'm once again just blown away by Liz's talent. Make sure you give her a follow on Instagram at EffieElfears, and we'll try and get Liz to do as many videos as possible because all of her recipes are simply amazing. Thank you so much for making that, Liz. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you very soon. If you enjoyed this one and you'd like to support me further like these legends on the screen, you can do so. Head to patreon.com/warhipster or head to ko-fi.com/warhipster. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all of that good stuff, and if you'd like to stay up to date, make sure to click the bell icon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.